As you know the story of the first miracle, we find Jesus with his disciples and he tells them to fill the jars with water, and they were shocked and they were horrified because these were the purification jars. So it would be a little bit like if you arrived in church today and you sanitized yourself and there was a bowl of water and Jesus came and said, I want you to fill these with water. And that's where Jesus begins the miracle today. And so, friends, it's really good to be with you today. As we anticipated today, we've been watching the Chosen series. If you haven't been able to watch that, the video series, really encourage you to do that. They're about an hour long. They're free. You can get them on YouTube. You can download the app. They're just a great portrayal of Jesus in a very human form. It's a little bit like when Jesus says to his disciples, get the other boys. It's kind of like it's a very colloquial way of dealing with Jesus, but it's just a good way of seeing how human and real Jesus was. And that's really the essence of the first miracle. It's a miracle that makes Jesus real to us. So we didn't anticipate that we would be back in October. We definitely didn't anticipate that we'd be able to share with you during communion. So it's a little bit like this incredible miracle that God offers us. I don't know about you, but over the last 7 months, we've been hearing a lot of people praying for miracles. And so let's look at how Jesus begins his public ministry through this miracle. So his mother says in John chapter 2, verse 5, do whatever he tells you. And now the 6 stone water jars had been set there for Jewish purification. Each contained 20 to 30 gallons. Fill the jars with water, Jesus said. So fill them to the brim. And then he said to them, now draw some of it out and take it to the chief servant. And they did. And the chief servant tasted the water that had been turned into wine. And he didn't realize that it had come through the servants who had drawn the water they knew. And then he called the bridegroom aside. And he said to them, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Thanks be to God for his word. Amen. And so as we have a look at this first miracle, I just thought we would focus a little bit this morning on why a wedding feast. Why would Jesus use a wedding feast as the moment where he brings about the very first miracle? So Jesus had already been ministering in the Galilee region. We'd seen him in Jerusalem. We know about him and John the Baptist, but he hadn't made his ministry public. So there wasn't a public display of his ministry yet, so he was waiting. There was this anticipation, and this is the moment where he crosses into a public ministry, and he chooses a wedding feast as the moment where he brings about a miracle. Now, in the Jewish customs, weddings would take a very long time. There'd be a betrothal for at least a year, a promise and a preparation to marry, where you wouldn't actually be able to separate in their betrothal, but there was the getting to know one another, the drawing of the families together, the anticipation of this week of celebration, a whole week of celebration. And that's not uncommon for us, particularly here in South Africa, that there's this betrothal period and a moment of celebration with incredible expectation and planning. Now, weddings and marriage is something very close to us as a family at the moment, because as you've shared our life journey, many of you will know that Rebecca is engaged to Chris, and they had planned to get married this year. They were supposed to get married in August, and as you know, with the pandemic, we've not been able to have their wedding. And so It's really been a year of anticipation and expectation and miracles and hoping and just kind of trying to figure out how we make sense of life, even in this kind of pandemic. So I'm really, really familiar with wedding preparation, and it involves the whole family. And it's kind of one family starts getting used to another family. So it's this major, major event. And so we also know that a marriage is a time where everybody gets to celebrate. A marriage is also a time where not only do you bind yourself to one another, make covenants and vows, but and provide economically for the future, but it's also a moment where you put aside your family feuds for a little bit, okay? And you wait to celebrate. It's the time where you say, well, everything gets put aside because now it's time to celebrate. And so this wedding feast was the moment where Jesus enters his public ministry, and the anticipation is it's time to celebrate. So as we've been through this devastating pandemic, as it has shifted and changed the fabric of our lives forever, it also gets to the point where it invites us into a different way of being, because it changes our lives forever. So the miracle of Jesus comes into our daily life and brings about a change. And so they had run out of wine, and that was like a major disaster. It was only the third day. There was like 4 more days to go, and they'd run out of wine. And so that meant that they would be embarrassed, that they would be humiliated, that it was really going to be such a time of humiliation. And people would be talking, and they would be gossiping, and it would just be an absolute disruption. And so Jesus comes along because his mother kind of says to him, I think the time is now. And so he comes into that place almost like hesitant about entering the public ministry, because he knows that once he enters his public ministry, the journey to the cross is very much closer. But he comes right into the very presence of our daily lives, and he begins to show us that the Messiah is not a Messiah for the temple, that the Messiah is not a Messiah for the sanctuary, that the Messiah, the one that changes our lives, is the Messiah for everyday miracles. Everyday miracles is who Jesus is. And so it kind of brings us, you and I, back to our lives right now. Many of us, our world, our nation, our country, our communities, our families, people that we know have been expecting miracles during the last 7 months. And many of us have seen miracles unfold. And the truth of the gift of this first miracle, of this wedding gift to us, is it shows us that the God we choose to worship comes to the presence of every detail of our lives and offers us an opportunity for a miracle. And Jesus will take, what I love about this story, what I love about this miracle is that Mary has such incredible faith that she says, do whatever he tells you to. Jesus performs miracles with whatever is in front of us. He doesn't go about and go to a vineyard and go and buy some more wine. He takes water that is stored in jars for purification, basically for washing of hands, and he turns the water into wine. And so in that moment, as the Messiah, Jesus not only becomes the bridegroom for the whole church, he shows us that our story of faith as Christians will be to make sure we find ourselves where people live out daily lives. I was listening to our presiding bishop who was preaching. She's just preached during our first conference. And she said the most amazing thing that has been something that we've been talking about for months, is that the church, and certainly the gathered church, particularly when lockdown happened, was not seen as an essential service. And so there is a kind of reawakening that has shaken the fabric of who we are as people who call themselves Christians and who we are as the gathered church. That we are forced to figure out that our gathering is not essential, but there is something about our choice of being the church when we're outside of these walls that matters most. I remember we were in East London and we had this little sign above the church door as you kind of entered out. It was like, now you are entering the mission field. And you see, as Christians, we find ourselves preoccupied by how our worship happens. But what Jesus does in this first miracle is he shows us it's how our life is lived that begins to become the essence of a miracle in each and every one of our lives. And so this first miracle reminds us that Jesus is in the detail and interested in the detail of your life and my life, whatever you are and whatever you're facing right now. I know right now that during these last 7 months, some of this time has been devastating for people. I know that there are people here that are gathering in church for the first time, and during this time of lockdown, you have buried a loved one. And we remember how important it is for us to hold the memory that we're not the same 7 months ago to what we are today. And so life is different. And Jesus hears that. For every one of us sitting here, each one of us needs a miracle somewhere. I don't know where you need a miracle. But it's a God that we worship wasn't a God of miracles. What would be the point of his ministry that was just set in miracles? He changes the way things are. He heals the wounds. He offers us a healing to things that seem impossible to heal. He recognizes that things change. And that's what I love about the story, that Jesus doesn't allow the humiliation of probably his mother's friends. That's probably who they were. He grew up in Cana. He grew up in Nazareth. Cana was a village very close to Nazareth. He didn't want his mother's friends to be humiliated. He doesn't want us to hurt. He wants to heal us. But he wants us to be open to the miracle presence. You know, what's incredible about this miracle is that when John's gospel is amazing, he gives us hints about why this is an important part of the big story. He says it's on the third day. We know that the wedding feasts were 7 days long, but he mentions the third day. And he does that for a reason. You see, we know that on the third day, Jesus rose again. And what we discover is that, we are a miracle people, but we're also a third day people. We live our lives out on the third day. We live our lives out with a resurrection presence. And so we know that certainly as a world and as a church and as individuals, our lives have changed profoundly. But we are a third day people. And it's on the third day that we start to experience the miracle of Jesus. Just think about communion. In a few moments, we're going to be sharing communion. So Jesus gathers his disciples before he is crucified, and he gathers them around the Passover meal, and he changes the Passover meal's meaning, and he says, I want you to gather and do this in remembrance of me. And when they gathered again, whether it was on the road to Emmaus as he broke the bread, whether they were out fishing along the lakeside, when he gathered again and he broke the bread and he drank the wine in front of them, he invited them to be a third day people. We could either be locked down into forcing things back to the way they were, or we could choose to be a third day people. And what does it mean to be a third day people? What does it mean when we look at our country and what our country is going to need post this pandemic? What does it mean when we look at our families? Sometimes the real rubber hits the road in our nuclear families. It's how we love and how we forgive and how we imagine miracles that really matters, and how we live out being a third-day people in our families. And so Jesus enacts this miracle in Cana as a third-day promise that what happens through his presence will be far better than what you've had before. And so everyone goes on and on and on about the fact that this wine is much better. 500 to 600 liters of wine Jesus made. I tried to buy pineapples during lockdown. And people decided that, I don't know what they were doing with pineapples, but I mean, there was a lot of bootlegging for those first couple of months. But like at the end of the day, it's like, the way we did things, we've all got stories to tell. I was speaking to Julie. She was talking a little bit about what was her life like during lockdown, like what has changed, and how are you going to live your life as a third-day person now, as a resurrected person? How do we live our lives with third-day mentality, with third-day hearts, with third-day mindsets? How do we live as a church in the third day? And so this miracle is a moment that changes everything. But just because the world has changed around us doesn't mean that we've changed in the inside. You see, Jesus uses these purification jars. And I've been thinking a lot about these jars. If you would go into the temple, if you'd go into people's homes, what is the one thing people needed to do? They needed to become ritually clean. So basically, the people wouldn't be able to eat a meal until they had gone through a ritual cleansing. People wouldn't be able to enter the temple until they'd gone through a ritual cleansing. So everything became about the ritual of religion rather than the condition of people's hearts. And so Jesus goes and he decides he's going to use a wedding feast, a moment when people gather, a moment to celebrate, a moment where we have a joyful opportunity to experience the gift of life, a moment where he shows himself as the bridegroom, but he takes the ritual cleansing and he takes these religious ceremonies. He takes what makes people clean. And we think that we are clean just because we've become ritually clean. People would go through this ritual to cleanse themselves, and then they were clean, they could eat, and they could interact with one another. But Jesus, you see, he says that is just the outward that gets cleaned. He wants to focus on the inward that matters most. And so there's this transformation from the inside out. He fills the water, he tells them to fill these jars to the brim. And as they fill to the brim, he changes the water into wine. You see, there's a sense that I want to talk from a church. We have rituals and we have religion that needs to be turned into wine that is just water for now. That we're stuck in our ritual and our religion, and Jesus wants to turn it into wine. We have relationships that are like water, and Jesus wants to turn them into wine. And one of the things that you notice about wine is you cannot put new wine in old wineskins. And so Jesus needs to deal also with the wineskins of our lives. And so today, as we start a new season at Gracepoint, and this season, whether you're online at home, whether you're somewhere else, maybe during the week watching this video, or if you're here in church, it's the moment where we say, Jesus, we are your jars of water, and we're waiting for you to change us into wine. That we become that presence of who you are in the world. We're going to enact in a while our communion. And it's a moment where, for some people, there's something, a burden that you've been carrying during COVID. You've lost a loved one. You've waited to gather. You've waited for a miracle. I'm going to ask you to use this moment to have the bread and the wine, and know that as you hold those elements, you hold a miracle in your hand. For we are a third day people. We are always a people of miracles. So Jesus takes the customs of the day. He takes the culture of the day. He takes the religion of the day. And he brings his presence that changes the composition of everything. He shifts relationships. He shifts the way we live. And so the gift of this wedding feast is to allow us to bring every part of who we are and to wait for God's miraculous presence in our lives. Smilo is going to join me now as we start preparing for communion now. As we prepare for our communion, I'm going to ask you to just, everyone, if you could just maybe just close your eyes with me. I'm going to ask you to, in your mind's eye, if you could just imagine that wedding feast. But I'm going to ask you now, just as we silence ourselves, I'm going to ask you to search your own hearts. Search your own lives. Where in your life right now are you needing Jesus' miracle? Jesus sees our everyday. Our faith journey is an invitation to be a third day people. And sometimes we're impatient for the third day because we want to make our own plans. And so as we come to this table, we come expecting a miracle. We come with our hearts that are broken because the last time we were in church, we were with our loved ones, and they have now passed. We come with our hope. We come with our joy. We come with our fear. We come with our humiliation. We come with our grief. We come just as we are.
Amen.